Hello, I'm Sang-won Lee from Gyeongsang National University in Jinju. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me to this wonderful workshop on the role of heterogeneity in complex systems. And I've been invited to this workshop for a couple of times, I believe. And this is definitely one of my favorite workshops in terms of topics, scale, and most of all, the atmosphere, which encourages all kinds of topics. So today I'll start my talk by emphasizing one word, inconsistency. What do you have in your mind when you hear this word, inconsistency? Well, I bet not many people find this word particularly encouraging, but my goal today is to change your perception about that when it comes to complex systems such as described by networks. So I present our series of work, some of which were published already and the rest is ongoing, on how to use this statistical inconsistency to uncover hidden structural properties of networks to our advantage and possibly quantifying somewhat mysterious notion of complexity in complex network. So the first part is about the inconsistency happening in one of the most heavily, perhaps too heavily studied topic of network science called community structure. A community structure of a network refers to this kind of a division of the entire network into pieces, where each of them is statistically more densely connected inside than the inter-community connections. This is a fairly intuitive concept, but at the same time, quite practical to see the structural and functional subunit lurking in network system. And one of the most conventional ways to detect such a community structure is to maximize this objective function called modularity. And basically it quantifies how many of the edges are intra-connected ones compared to the background or expected one expressed by this null model term for a given community partition. And I'll come back to this null model term in the final example of part 1 related to this biological example. And maximizing this function corresponds to finding the most densely intra-connected subparts. And a bit technical but important part that help you to follow my talk is this resolution parameter gamma in front of this null model term. And it controls the overall scales of communities found, where the larger value of gamma yields smaller communities or larger number of communities, as illustrated here. And the problem of maximizing the modularity is, of course, computationally challenging because of the combinatorially exploding number of possible divisions here. And in fact, how to cleverly find approximate solution is the key to this modularity-based technique. By the way, can you guess which algorithm I used for this visualization of community detection? Well, in fact, I did nothing. In this highly artificial example, a simple network visualization layout provided by the famous package Network X produces this nice, clear division between communities. I mentioned this because it's the key element for the part 2 of my talk, so stay tuned. So let's find communities. Well, you may think that this kind of statement, detect the community structure, looks like a completely innocent order if you just study network community detection. But if you are a practitioner of community detection and try to find the community especially with the stochastic algorithm, you will immediately encounter this common situation. So you run the algorithm and get this very nice result. Well, that's it. This is the community structure, you may think, and start to write the paper. Unfortunately, if you run this code again and again, you will get these results. Therefore, you will end up with this ensemble of community structures, not a single one. By the way, I have to give a proper credit to Professor Itae Kim, who first realized this during his graduate study on power grid network in Chile back in 2015. So the issue here is the inconsistency of the result. So is this necessarily a bad thing that should be somehow fixed? Well, in fact, just like the famous glass is half empty versus glass is half full argument, we can use them to study structural properties of network. First, we can construct this co-occurrence matrix for each node pair, whose elements indicate the fraction of node pair belonging to the same communities in this ensemble of community structure found. And if a pair of nodes always belongs to the same community or always belong to the different community, the matrix elements become 1 or 0, respectively. So the intermediate values here indicate the inconsistency. So in this example, only the 3 nodes between the 2 obvious bulk of communities are responsible for this inconsistency. So based on the co-occurrence matrix, in collaboration with Professor Hite Kim, we formulated this inconsistency called companionship inconsistency, or COI, of an individual node by simply symmetrizing it and taking average over all of the other nodes. We can treat this COI value as a new node centrality to quantify the local measure of community inconsistency, which may eventually reveal the functional flexibility of the node. If you are familiar with the node centrality, you may ask, this type of bridginess can also be detected with the famous betweenness centrality as well. That's a very good question, but here's our counterexample. Because the betweenness centrality only takes the shortest path between nodes, it cannot detect this bridge part composed of 2 nodes. So we believe that our measure, based on the co-occurrence matrix, represents the more genuine nodal community inconsistency. Another keen observer would point out that this symmetrization process can be problematic when a node switch between more than 2 communities, but I'll come back to the problem later when I introduce the more sophisticated local measure we develop later. As an appropriate example, we generated the clustered Erdoshi-Renyi random network, where we loosely connect the pre-assigned communities composed of a dense random network and put a number of inconsistent nodes intentionally. So the pre-assigned community structure is colored on the left side, featured as a kaleidoscope image, by the way. And the shade on the right side correspond to the COI value. So if you just try to detect the community structures here, the central part composed of this inconsistent node is just labeled randomly. But the inconsistency measure effectively captured the membership is in fact inconsistent. So we cannot trust this label here. And this is the most famous or infamous example of the network community called the Jackery's Karate Club network, where a karate club was split into 2 communities as a result of the fight between the instructor and the administrator, reported by the sociologist Wayne Jackery in the 70s. And at this particular value of gamma, we found this interesting node with the absolutely larger value of COI than any other node, meaning that this member is most neutral about this reported dispute inside, especially because this node, unfortunately, only has a 2 neighbor. We call this node outsider. The second example is a slightly bigger one, the Star Wars characters network. For those of you knowing the stuff, these are the network of characters appearing in the original trilogy of the movie Star Wars. And they are connected if they appear in the same scene. And in this network, the Luke Skywalker, the main protagonist in the entire series, naturally interact with the various characters in different communities, including his father. Sorry for spoiler for this 45-year-old movie, by the way. And of course, he's far from being outsider. So we call him a multiplayer, characterized by both by large degree and larger inconsistency value simultaneously. So we can set up some ad hoc measure like the product of the degree and the Koi value to characterize the multiplayer, distinguished from the outsiders, just as an example. In case you are not comfortable with our result based on the famous or infamous karate club and fictional characters, here are more real world example networks. So, for example, if you look at the consistency values of the Chilean power grid node, they show some gradual change of Koi across different nodes, which may imply the different levels of the hierarchical community structure. So in the paper published in 2019, we presented the main idea of using local community inconsistency as a kind of node centrality and its implication. And of course, the correlation between the inconsistency and other centrality measures. But we believe that there should be more systematic studies on this problem. First, we took the resolution parameter here and later arbitrarily, and we didn't have some kind of a global measure to quantify the overall network-wide inconsistency. Thankfully, Daekyung Lee, a smart and outstanding graduate student back then, and now a postdoc in Austria, read our paper and contacted us for a potential follow-up study. So it was just a perfect timing for us. And Daekyung came up with the global measure of inconsistency called the partition inconsistency, or PI, based on the cutting-edge similarity measure for different community partition, and more sophisticated local measure of inconsistency called the membership inconsistency, or MAI. Both of which have this nice scaling property, namely the effective number of different configurations in the global level and independent membership in the local level. So for details, please check out our paper here. And instead of going through all the mathematical terms here, here's an illustrative example to show the difference between MAI and Koi, for example. I hope you remember that I said rather heuristically defined Koi might have some problem with more than two communities. And here, we let the central part of the node switch among three different communities instead of two communities. Then, the newly developed MAI is good at detecting the bulk part of the inconsistent region, while the Koi is good at detecting the even boundaries of the bulk inconsistent regions, fundamentally because it's the maximum at the region where the node switching between exactly two communities, even if there are three communities competing one another here. And by far the most important aspect of this recent work is that we finally started to look at the whole spectrum of communities by adjusting the resolution parameter gamma. So by looking at the global measure of inconsistency, or the pi, as a function of community resolution, we can pinpoint the range of gamma where the inconsistency becomes very small, or in other words, consistent or reliable communities are found, especially when the number of communities stay flat as a certain integer value, just like the shaded regions here. By using the series of model network with the single level and double level of hierarchical community, we verify that our measure can find these most consistent communities across different community resolution. And by taking various real-world networks again, we can actually pinpoint the regions of meaningful community structure. If you recall our assumption of hierarchical community structure in the Chilean power grid, it is verified here by observing this very nice stepping structures of a number of communities with low values of inconsistency throughout this region. I mean, it's not easy to get this clear-cut evidence in real network, as the audience would agree. For all of the details, please check out our paper, including all the technicality. And one particularly interesting application is this chromatin interaction in the chromosomes in biological organisms. As most of you know, chromosomes have this complicated, non-trivial folded structure inside cell nuclei. When I first learned about this structure in biology class, I believe all of the details about the packing structure is well known. But of course it was not. I think this is one of many examples that are unknown even if we decoded the human genome sequence itself. Deciphering this structure is of course crucial to understand how this fundamental genetic material or chromatin works in cells. And the major breakthrough step to reveal the physical proximity between genomic sequence is this interaction map of chromatin loci called Hi-C. So this Hi-C technique provides the physical proximity or the interaction frequency between two chromatin loci in this matrix form. And as you can see here, some non-trivial structures are observed here and there, depending on the resolution, which is in fact important clues to reveal the 3D structure. For example, this off-diagonal part in higher resolution is an evidence of the loop structure, as the title of this paper suggests. Another famous example in the low resolution is this block diagonal substructures called topologically associated domain, or TAD, which obviously represent local packing. So when I first saw this structure, I realized that suddenly this is just a very familiar problem to me. I mean, if we consider the loci as a node and the weight between them as a weighted edges, detecting such a block diagonal structure precisely corresponds to the community detection problem in network science. So if you think you have already seen these slides, that's because you really have. I brought back this old slide again to talk about the things I briefly mentioned before. We can think about this null model term here, especially for this chromosome interaction data, because this product of the degrees or strengths here assumes that the only information available to us is the strength of the background interaction for each node. So we use this best guess that interaction between the two nodes will be proportional to those background interaction. However, in this example of the chromatin interaction, we know much more than that. And the additional information is the fact that the chromosomes are basically 3D folded structures from the 1D sequence. In other words, we can clearly distinguish between the cases of the pair of loci located far away from those very closely located in the genomic or 1D sequence. Moreover, thanks to the studies on the contact probability scaling as a function of sequence distance here, we know that the background interaction between the two loci follow this so-called fractal globule scaling, with the contact probability inversely proportional to the 1D distance. So we use this fractal globule null model term, composed of both the overall interaction structure here and this well-known scaling behavior in the modularity function throughout this study. So in this paper published in 2019, we discovered some biologically relevant scales of community with a tailor-made null model term based on our literature search. However, with the fresh new eyes, with the possibility of the community inconsistency, we can detect the most appropriate scales that allow the most reliable community structure solely from the consistency analysis alone. And we applied the framework to this Hi-C data in this paper. From the global inconsistency measure on the left, we can see that different chromosomes have different ranges of gamma corresponding to the various levels of reliability. And on the right, we can see that local or node level inconsistency profile across the chromosome 10 here, for example. And depending on the chromatin state, in terms of activity, we found active regions systematically have larger local inconsistency or less stable communities. At first, I found this a bit puzzling because from another study here, we discovered that those active regions are more modular or hierarchical. And here our interpretation is that more active regions appears to be involved in multiple independent community arrangements, which could induce more lower stability. So in contrast, inactive regions are tightly compacted within the cell nuclei, so which might lead to more stable 3D co-localization of these DNA segments with higher stability. And in fact, we found a reference paper supporting this argument. Of course, we would need more fundamental biological basis for our interpretation here as well. Now, so much for the community inconsistency, and let's move on to different types of inconsistency in network analysis. The second part of my talk is about network embedding inconsistency, and perhaps some audience would find this concept of embedding not so intuitive. So I'll start to talk about my motivation to study this topic way back to early 2010s when I was a postdoc in Umeå, Sweden, working with Professor Petter Holme. At that time, I was working on the routing on pathfinding problems on networks endowed with the geometry information. And giving the geometric coordinate for each node is embedding, which is getting more popular these days thanks to its application to machine learning. For example, you can naturally assume that this network is embedded in the two-dimensional Euclidean space layout, and we can use this geometric information to find the pathways without the knowledge of global topology. And this famous greedy routing algorithm is a simple strategy of moving to the neighbor closest to the target, and obviously sometimes fails like this. So instead of original greedy routing strategy, we first modify the geometric information to the directional one, where the agents move to the neighbors in the closest direction to the target. And we also allow the backtracking process by adding ingredients of memory on the path up to that point. We call this greedy spatial navigation, or GSN, and we can compare the performance with the real shortest path and random depth first search. And we reported the application of this protocol to real road network in this paper, which was featured in interestingly Swedish local newspaper and APS website. Well, I have to say that I'm not a big fan of this title they used, but anyway, an interesting question regarding our main topic is actually this. Why does GSM perform so well in this case? I mean, this has nothing to do with the real world transportation structure, but it's just the default layout for network visualization applied to this small model network called Kamada-Kawai spring-based network layout. And its main purpose is, of course, to make it look good to human eyes, but there's an important side effect. Nodes closer in the network tends to be located closer in the geometric space as well. And if you recall, it can even detect communities. So a bit less known work of ours is to apply the greedy navigation strategy to systematically study the amount of exploitable geometric information captured by this network visualization algorithm. And we found that the greedy navigation indeed works better in a model network with the more spatial or clustering elements if you set the node coordinate with the visualization algorithm. And in fact, we even tried to come up with the optimal network layout for greedy navigators using the famous simulated annealing processes, where we decide to accept the trivial movement depending on its effects on the GSM path length with the element of the high-end road temperature or noise term. And can you guess what this network is? Well, if you use our algorithm of layout optimization for greedy navigation, we can recover its natural layout of circles. And it's easy to see that the circular layout always induces the optimal path finding. And this is another example, another more complicated structure. And we compare the properties of this GSM pathway optimized layout to the layout for visualization. And overall, the navigability optimized layout produces more sharp angles, and we measured other things like deviation from the straight line, etc. for different networks. and reported the result in this paper. So it was already 13 years ago. I haven't thought about this problem for quite a while. Until my brilliant graduate student, Ga-hyun, came up with this question and asked me very recently. So she was inspired by some undergraduate student project for my network science course, where one student analyzed the Korean train route network and another student analyzed the Korean intercity bus route network. Her question was, why different types of layout for different types of network? Well, it turns out that it was a simple misunderstanding because the train route was drawn with the actual geographical coordinate, while the bus route was drawn on the layout for visualization. But the question itself is a pretty valid one. And eventually, the question was reformulated as the possibility of the different layout or geometrical embedding for a given topological network structure. Because I also recall that when I demonstrated the network visualization in my network science course, for example, I realized that the default network layouts are different every time I generated for a given network. Here the Karate Club again. Therefore, what Ga-hyun realized this year is basically similar to the community detection version inspired Professor Hee-tae Kim exactly a decade ago. As people say, great minds think alike. So we decided to systematically investigate this problem of network embedding inconsistency, or NEI. So basically, our analysis suggests this spectrum of network embedding inconsistency depending on the type of networks. Regular networks usually have a pretty consistent layout. Random networks have a highly variable embedding. And of course, the most interesting part is this complex network with heterogeneous or non-trivial substructures such as communities, which has layout consistent in the larger scale, but showing variability in the smaller scale. And this spectrum naturally reminds us of this phase transition of matter, solid, liquid, and gas. And our embedding algorithm used here is perhaps rather unfamiliar even to my fellow network scientists, called the multi-dimensional scaling, or MDS method. And I don't have time to explain all the details about this algorithm, as its technicality is vast enough to fill out this entire book. But you can just remember that the objective function to minimize here is the discrepancy between the hopping and Euclidean distances. And the function is, of course, invariant under the rotation and reflection in the two-dimensional Euclidean space as desired. And due to, or thanks to its initial condition dependency of optimization processes, different realizations are produced each time we apply the MDS method. And they are represented by this nice stacked image of distance matrices between node pair created by Ga-hyun. And this sigma UV squared is the variance of Euclidean distance between node U and node V across different embedding realization. And the average of sigma over all node pair is this average network embedding inconsistency, or NEI here. As a reference, the NEI value shows the greatest expressive range for the MDS compared to other famous network visualization algorithms such as FR and KK. And that's our real motivation to choose the MDS in the first place. And we can also interpret this inconsistency as an exploration of the energy landscape defined by the objective function of MDS. Regular networks corresponds to the simple energy landscape as we change the network layout. Random network has a random or very rugged energy landscape, yielding a large inconsistency. And complex network has the most interesting one, of course, rugged but some non-trivial local minima that induce the intermediate level of the inconsistency. Again, we can use this analog of a phase transition here. So now we have this notion of the spectrum of NEI as a measure of randomness or complexity, but we need to be more sophisticated when it comes to real network, because we would like to come up with a measure to extract the intrinsic structural factor. So we divide the original NEI value by the one from its randomized version with the same number of nodes and edges. So there are some example networks in various fields here, which show the different levels of difference compared to their random counterpart, which quantify their structured or random nature. Of course, we can try different types of randomization, for example, the degree preserving edge shuffling, etc., to sharpen the measure even more as a future work. And just as in the local consistency or communities, we define the node or edge centrality based on the NEI by calculating the change in the NEI values when a node or an edge is missing from the network. So this NEI centrality quantify the contribution of each node or edge to the overall inconsistency. And it's interesting to note that there are both positive and negative values, which means that some nodes or edges maintain the consistency while others actually cause structural inconsistency. And the distinction may provide a valuable hint when we operate the real world network. So if anyone is interested, please contact me or stay tuned for our paper coming hopefully soon. So here's the summary you can just skim through. And the most important key concept is, of course, as I already emphasized in the very first part of my talk, the statistical inconsistency. And I showed you two examples. The first one is from community detection, and the other is from network embedding. And I believe that both problems have both sides of a theoretical and practical aspect worth investigating further. So please contact me if you have any suggestion or comment, which may become another starting point of the great collaboration. So thank you very much for your consistent attention throughout my talk.